Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek Show. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, known most places as Nerd Numbers. With me, as always, is my producer, voice of God, man of many hats, Brian Foster. And this week, we're going to be talking history and $100 million NBA contracts. And we are into the offseason officially, so that will probably be it. Say hey, Brian.
Yeah, what's going on, Dre? And this probably is the last real week of news from the offseason for a while, unfortunately. The Summer League's done. You know, we talked to Chris Ye last week, and we have two big contracts being signed we're going to talk about today. So, yeah, we're entering the dog days soon.
All right. So, unfortunately, this doesn't date us at all because I'm going to say we are coming on the heels of a gun shooting in the United States, which, as I mentioned,
three of them.
Doesn't date. Yeah, Jesus. All right. The obvious big one is El Paso. And we were discussing pre-show how much we wanted to talk about it. And I basically said, I kind of had some gallows. I don't know if it's gallows humor or gallows analyst take where my brain's kind of broken, Brian, as I've said to you, and I relate a lot of stuff to sports, as is apparent on the show. And a few things did pop into my head, which completely trivialize it, but also let me rant. And I find that's a coping mechanism because at this point in United States history, both politically and in regards to gun violence, there are times where you just go, look at it. It's a very defeatist policy. It is baffling to me how hard it is to fight against people that argue for the Second Amendment for a variety of reasons. I'm going to get my first tangent on, Brian, so I put the tangent counter at 1 for the show. A remarkable part of the Constitution to me is the Fourth Amendment. So for those that don't know, I think I'm getting this right, Brian. Fourth Amendment is no illegal search and seizure. So it's both, but for a country that's supposed to be kind of almost libertarian and ideal, if you look at the original Constitution and the original founders who are kind of like, don't tread on me, Britain, no big government. The Fourth Amendment says, the government's not allowed to take your stuff would be the way to translate it. This last
corrupt cops could just come into your house and take stuff and no one to hold them accountable, right? Historically, that's a big problem for people.
But that's the ironic part is so the Fourth Amendment from the very get-go is in the Constitution saying don't do that. For those that don't know, this past year, the United States Supreme Court ruled, and it was like, I don't think it was a close call. So this isn't even one of those where you can argue, the unfair stacking of the courts by Republican presidents in the past couple of years, Trump and then, of course, Bush before him. You could make the argument they shouldn't have had the right to select the Supreme Court justices they did, is what it is. But you can't even argue that. The Supreme Court ruled that if you are passed out in your car, it is okay for the police to draw your blood and then analyze it basically without your consent. So from a Fourth Amendment standpoint, the start of the government's not allowed to take your stuff, I don't think any founder would be like, wait a minute, you're telling me if you're asleep, the government can take your blood? That's where we are in that. So the Fourth Amendment and the Fourth Amendment for years has gotten degraded. One of the things is called probable cause, which was basically the death of the Fourth Amendment, which is police are allowed to say, hey, stop. If you don't stop, they can say, hey, you're acting suspicious. As a result, I have a reason to stop you, probable cause. So probable cause says if the police believe they have a reason to stop you and search you, they can. And probable cause can be as simple as them saying, hey, stop, let me search you. And if you say no, they say, hey, that's suspicious. So when people want to argue the Bill of Rights and constitutional amendments is something that is sacred, you just go, hey, look, the Fourth Amendment is a freaking joke. Another one, right, is in our Constitution, it says no unreasonable bail, and that is a huge problem in this country. So it gets very amusing to me that anybody goes, don't take my gun. I'm a constitutionalist. I believe in the Bill of Rights, Second Amendment. You go, why do you not care about so many other things? It's very telling. As well as the Second Amendment in it said, a well-regulated militia being important. And first off, as we get on it, as let's lose the entire audience immediately, Brian, by getting on our soapbox. That part of that was racially driven. Basically, landowners said we want a right to defend ourselves on the off chance that slaves don't like being slaves. That was part of the reasoning for don't take my guns. But another part was the United States at the time of its founding did not have a standing military. And they were saying, hey, having a militia being key to, uphold the country, we need the right to have guns. If you flash forward to where we are now, not having a military isn't a problem. The last part, Brian, as I mentioned, I've been on a Hamilton kick. Been loving listening to the musical. In Hamilton, the weird thing to me about that musical, if we look back at it, something that people don't consider being a norm, is that duels were common in our history. And
amongst major people, too. Politicians, like famously Aaron Burr and Hamilton himself, right? So, yeah.
Aaron Burr, for those that have forgotten, was he was kind of the death of the original plan of the vice president, if I understand it. So the old school, and I wouldn't hate this as a method, the old school United States worked this way. You'd vote for president. First place was president. Second place was vice president. And there could be a lot of interestingness there, right, where you might get opposing ideas in president and vice president. Of course, you also got weirdness. As an example, Abraham Lincoln selected Andrew Johnson. Did I get that right?
Yeah, Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, which was the slave party at the time. He was not a Republican. He wasn't like Lincoln's running mate or anything. Yeah.
So weirdness there. But anyway, that used to be.
And just to add to that, he became president after Lincoln died, right? And he had to oversee Reconstruction, and of course, he totally tanked it because he was against it. So yeah, it was what the effect you're talking about was a huge, huge problem for the aftermath of the Civil War.
Yeah. Opposing parties being president and vice president being an interesting idea, and then also possibly getting in the way. And that was the case. Aaron Burr was a vice president in our history, although Thomas Jefferson didn't like him, so there were some feuds there. So anyway, but yeah, when you're saying major politicians, the musical Hamilton talks about Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, who was Washington's right-hand man, was the Department of Treasury, founded the Federal Bank, all of that. And Aaron Burr was the vice president. One of the most notorious presidents, Andrew Jackson, one of the worst presidents, by the way, in terms of horribleness. When people say how racist Trump is, Andrew Jackson is in hell laughing at him about that. But Andrew Jackson was in tons of duels, including he told somebody in a duel to take the first shot. He was hit in the first shot, said, ha, 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 you didn't shoot hard enough, and killed him. The reason I bring that up as a point is when I was thinking Alexander Hamilton and looking this up, in old school days, founding father days of the United States, guns were, musket balls. These are basically, cylindrical ball, a marble essentially that was shot out of a barrel. And to compare it to sports, to get us back to sports briefly, Brian, it was like a knuckleball in baseball is how I've heard it described. So these things did not have they didn't shoot straight. They had wild movement. And they were not as dangerous. As I mentioned, Andrew Jackson was hit in a duel and survived. When we talk about Alexander Hamilton being killed in his duel, the surprising part is actually that he died. Part of that is that the time was he was hit, and then back in the day, medicine wasn't as good, so you could get infection, et cetera, and die from more minor wounds.
It took him weeks to die, right?
Is that true?
I think so, yeah. I think it took him like days or weeks after the duel with Burr to die. Yeah.
And yeah, his son died as well. And basically in his son's duel, they stood around for a minute and a half. I was reading up on it. And that's the surprise, right? People would get in these duels that were just kind of a pissing contest. And then you might get injured and go off. And then occasionally, because it was that time where medicine wasn't as good, you die from injuries related to a dueling wound. But that's the key. When we talk about United States history and guns, the state of guns when the country was founded is nothing like now. So, as I mentioned, anybody arguing the Constitution, you have to ignore so much else of the Constitution that has been corrupted or just outright ignored by our current government to act as if you have a leg to stand on there. And then additionally, to act as if the reasons for the Second Amendment even apply a little today is wrong. So that's my 2 cents on gun violence, et cetera. Now, the interesting part that actually elevated it to the script is Beto O'Rourke, who is not going to be president, although, of course, saying such things might seem silly in the future because no one thought Trump was going to be president either.
That's right.
Beto O'Rourke was approached by the media because he did speak at El Paso after the shooting. And what I love that he did, and I hope more of this happens and not in the Trump way, is calling the media on their bullshit. So this gets in a hard spot, Brian. I don't want to end up on the Trump fake news stupid area that too many, Make America Great hatters have fallen into. I kind of dislike that. But at the same time, the media is very headline driven, clickbaity driven, and then worse, what's frustrating, and this is very much what Trump does. We were talking this pre-show. People realize that they can basically abuse the media for their own gain and self-interest. And so when Beto O'Rourke was asked about it, he was like, give me a fucking break, media. Trump comes out here and calls Mexicans rapists and murderers and basically says it's okay to shoot at them. And that did happen in a speech. Someone said, like, shoot them, and he laughed, and he's like, only in Florida, I think is what he said. And then,
so specifically what he was doing it in Florida, but he said you can only do that in the Panhandle, which is kind of off away from where all the cities are, right? So it was he was giving them a nod. The essence of what you said is correct.
But so when people were asking, I think a reporter asked Beto O'Rourke what he thought about Trump, he was like, give me a fucking break. You're not going to call him on it. You're complicit in this, which I'm summarizing. Look up the original quote, and I should have had it in front of me, but I don't. But I've seen people love that, and I agree. And again, to trivialize it by comparing to sports, we've done this many, many times. We bring up Adrian Wojnarowski, which is very similar, which is so much of the sports media relies on clickbaits, headline driven, getting eyeballs.
Adrian Wojnarowski is Trump. Is that where we're going here? I hope not.
The other way around. I'm saying Adrian
good.
Wojnarowski reminds me very much, you might say, like Nate Silverish, right? And we might talk Nate Silver a little bit more in the future, where Adrian Wojnarowski is being played kind of. I think Adrian Wojnarowski is a little better than the political media in the United States because he knows he's getting played, but he's playing back. Like, he knows what he's doing, which is he knows that by being a mouthpiece for agents and teams, that he gets earlier access to stories, which he is then allowed to turn into eyeballs, which then allows him to turn into a brand. And political media is the same way. We were talking pre-show, and Trump has said it. I think Michelle Wolf said it at the
correspondence dinner. Yeah,
where it's just like I think Trump said it best. Where he's like, you love me, I sell, I get you eyeballs, I sell papers, you guys love me. And that's the key for however many places. NBC is the worst of the bunch here, where NBC might pretend to hate Trump because certain shows like SNL or whatever bash him. At the same time, they will give him a platform to speak directly. He hosted SNL in his run up to be president. He had a very softball interview with Jimmy Fallon where Jimmy Fallon, tasseled his hair. And, NBC knows Trump is eyeballs, so we will let him say his stuff because it gets us people to look. And so again, Beto O'Rourke saying that about Trump reminds me very much of the sports media, which is in the same boat, where so many of these sports media companies, Adrian Wojnarowski being the worst, go, I know that I want eyeballs, so I will let agents use me to sell stories. Anthony Davis is only looking at 3 teams, or this player wants to go here, or this team has expressed interest in that player. That's them leaking a story for someone, because don't forget, if you're Magic Johnson and come out and say, we would like Paul George, you can get fined $500,000 for tampering. So the way to get around that is you use media sources, and then in exchange, they do it for eyeballs. And so those kind of relate to each other. And, I've said this a lot about sports. I love sports because sports is trivial. Adrian Wojnarowski leaking a story for the Clippers or whatever does not hurt me the next day. Whereas a political person repeating like verbatim, the ones I hate the most, Brian, right, are Trump says something inflammatory, and like a Yahoo or MSNBC or whoever will just repeat the thing that he says. So it'll be, if Trump says something, I don't even want to say because I don't want to be in the same boat, right? But Trump will say something inflammatory about Hispanics or Mexicans, and then I'll just see verbatim that quote, and then at the very end says Trump. So I'm like, what are you doing, media? You are elevating that message. You are not taking a stand, and you're doing it for eyeballs, and that's very frustrating.
Yeah, it's been one of the most frustrating things these past few years for me, for sure. And this gets into George Lakoff, right? He's a professor at UC Berkeley, and he talks a lot about how you frame arguments. And yeah, the media is just happy to use Trump's framing, right? And if we can pivot a little bit, to the Mueller report, he just said no collusion, no collusion. He got all of his surrogates to say that, even to the point where Mueller himself had to point out in the report that collusion is a lay term and not, a legal term at all outside of, antitrust anyway, which is not involved here, right? So, yeah, so the media just goes along with his framing and doesn't even question it. And it's And I think individual journalists would push back and say, non-journalists don't get it. You don't understand that we have editors, we have fact checkers, and we have this whole process and everything. And I get that, but there's still just something like captured within the Beltway, right? I think that, Trump goes out there and lies to all of his surrogates, and then they go out and say that lie, and agnostically, maybe they think he's telling the truth, maybe they think he's lying, or maybe they don't care. And then people say, well, I got the same lie from 3 different sources, so it must be true. And the lie just takes on its own, meaning. So yeah, it's the media's been captured inside the Beltway to some extent. And I have found myself looking more to international and independent sources lately.
Interesting. Well, I mean, I think it's not a saving grace. Here's the undepressing point that I keep bringing, that I brought up on a few shows, which is when we act surprised or upset or infuriated, and I'm going to say rightly so at a lot of things, it's sometimes comforting to say this has always been a problem.
Yep.
The media and that has always been an issue. Yellow journalism, back in the day, Spanish-American War, that kind of stuff has always been around. As I mentioned, I've been on a Hamilton kick. Hamilton and other founding fathers would use the media to spread information about each other.
Can I say briefly, it's just so jarring to us because, the past, 50 or 60 years has kind of been a unique period of time of quality journalism, right? And so now it's starting to unravel and go back to the way you were talking about. And that's why I think we have such a hard time dealing with it.
It is very Game of Thrones, just like the winter is coming, because for those that have forgotten, the premise of Game of Thrones is the seasons aren't normal because they're on a weird axis or whatever story George R. R. Martin came up with. So winters last a really long time and summers last a really long time. So the seasons aren't normal. So the current crop of people, the current heroes of the story the kids basically have only known summer, have only known this good time. And I know you and I are in this very weird period, right, where essentially, people joke about millennials, but I would actually say it's the next generation after Gen Z or whatever they're called. When we were young, Brian, you and I, we were dealing with, the fall.
I'll just say I wish I was a millennial, Dre. I'm not quite. I'm a little bit older than that. But for this conversation, I will consider myself an honorary millennial.
Yeah, I was going to say, you and I are the same range of, we were just around, I think we were young right as the Iron Curtain fell, right at the end of the Soviet Union, right when there was, the first Iraq War.
Yep.
So there was this period of tension that had been in existence for a really long time. Basically, if you want to talk like World War I through the Cold War, that ended, and there was this period of prosperity where, the problems that we dealt with the United States were like, oh my goodness, the president had an affair, tee hee 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 hee.
Yep.
So I think that's what you're saying, right? Is there's this period maybe from early 90s to, even if you want to talk the Afghanistan war, that's wasn't the same, didn't hit home. So like there's been this period of like not seeing it. And then suddenly when the United States is under, assault, albeit in this way, like in a cyber war sense with like Russia, we're not used to it. And you're saying, and so then seeing all of this stuff, seeing more authoritarian leadership, seeing, assaults from, I don't know if it's that's the interesting part about Russia is if you want to compare on so many fronts, Russia versus the United States from a technological standpoint, monetary standpoint, military standpoint is so much bigger, but we're basically, ironically, in the same way that like the United States, when they were fighting against Britain, fighting a different way that the older superpower wasn't used to.
Yep.
That's kind of where we're at now. And so when we're saying we're just not used to it, I think you've got the right take, which is you go through all of history. You really can't even go 30 years without seeing something like this happen, even in United States history. We're just not used to it because we were in like a 30-year period where it was very rare.
Now, I'll take it one step further, briefly a little bit further, which is, you mentioned authoritarianism and fascism, right? So like you said, we're just coming off these 3 big mass shootings and, related to white supremacy, right? So everyone's, which is, related to Nazism and fascism. And so everyone's worried about that right now. Well, I kind of feel like this whole generation that's in charge right now, the boomers, they're the first generation that doesn't remember World War I and World War II, right? Literally fighting against the fascists. The boomers, by definition, were born after World War II. So Yeah, I think no one, and there are some greatest generation people still alive that fought in World War II and remember it, but they're not in charge anymore. And I think
you and I were talking this because the military comes up as a very convenient shield for a lot of conservatives. But what I should stress, we were talking this in World War II time, 10% of the population enlisted to fight in World War II. And that was at the time. Don't forget the whole point of baby boomers is there's this huge influx of population growth after. So the people, the greatest generation that were around to fight World War II, a majority of them did not fight in World War II. And don't forget, if you go back in history, a lot of the United States sentiment at the time was non-interventionist, let's not fight, et cetera. And some, this is an uncomfortable one. Geez, Brian, we're staying away from sports. I'll try and get us back in a second. But like I've been loving I love the Cracked podcast, and they brought this up, is a lot of Hitler's philosophies, and this is uncomfortable, came from observing United States, observing what we did with the Native Americans. Eugenics as just an idea was a popular idea in, the 1920s, 1930s.
He famously wrote about Jim Crow in Mein Kampf.
Dear God.
Which is his prison manifesto or whatever. But
so anyway, to finish up your point of just saying, people not remembering war, it's like it's important to notice that even of that generation, a lot of them weren't there and it was still split. So it's not as we want to rewrite our history to say, oh, back in that time, everybody was on United States as a whole collectively stood up and said no to Hitler. That was not the case.
Yeah, there was fascists, and communists in the United States, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, I don't know, Brian. I mean, it's one of those where, like I said, in some cases, this is how I cope, where it's like I find trivial ways to compare it to sports, because in some ways it's, you can contribute to causes, you can vote, you can do that kind of stuff, which I do. But at the same time, sometimes to just have mental sanity, you want to just think about other things. And of course, what I do is if you have this basketball podcast you come and listen to, I'm like, ha, fooled you. You're going to have to think about politics for a bit.
Well, maybe next time we can do the politics at the end like we normally do, but I've enjoyed this conversation so far.
All right, well, interestingly, I want to use this, there are a few things I like doing, Brian. Some of my haterade of Kobe Bryant that I'm notorious for, and then also Nate Silver. You and I were having this conversation, and I did want to relate that because I found what a lot of people do with politics. Actually, I'm going to use this to do a long thesis, Brian, that may become a post someday. You and I were talking this, and I was saying on the Unpopular Opinion Network, Adam Todd Brown talked about the decline of the baseball industry in the 90s. A couple parts were the baseball card industry basically had a bubble, in part because there used to be scarcity back in the day. The way baseball cards used to work is you'd make like a limited run of a set of baseball cards at the beginning of the year, because younger players that we don't know are going to be good aren't necessarily popular at the time, right? So, you might not even know that a player is going to be coming into the league. So a rookie card might be rare because they only print out what baseball cards used to do, Brian, sorry about this, is they would print out, beginning of the year, the entire known roster. End of the year, if there were call-ups, they would print out the players that were called up. And then so you might have a rookie card of a young player that was rarer than the normal cards, and those cards might be rare as well because they did intentionally make stars rarer than normal people in baseball cards. So a rookie card of a player might be incredibly rare because you didn't know what to expect from that rookie. And this is much more true in baseball than in basketball, right? Because baseball is a minor league system. So a player that turns great might only play a couple games getting called up from the minor before they actually break out. It's a little different than basketball. In the 90s, Ken Griffey was just this known commodity. In part, his father was a major player as well. A company called Topps just printed tons and tons and tons of Ken Griffey rookie cards. And so people thought these were going to skyrocket in value because that's what typically happened with rookie cards, not realizing there was this huge surplus in the market. So suddenly when people started realizing, oh, my Ken Griffey rookie card Ken Griffey junior rookie card isn't rare, the market kind of imploded on it. And then, of course, there was the baseball strike. So in the 90s, the baseball industry kind of fell a peg from its place in the American culture zeitgeist. Now, as we note as the cold calculating economists, demand for watching games in terms of how much it was worth to television contracts, as well as it was worth for people actually going to the stadiums to watch, didn't really fall. But if we examine like World Series ratings, they just did steadily decline from the 90s on. Funny part though, the lockout or strike in the 1990s, mid 1990s, I looked this up, Brian, didn't actually tank World Series World Series viewership. It actually went up from the year before the strike, but as a whole, it was already on a downhill trend. And we were talking about, and I was saying, I think a lot of people basically migrated from baseball as a very tribal, this is my team kind of thing, to politics. That's my theory. I don't have any proof for it. It's just kind of a back burner theory, because you notice that now with a lot of politics, people basically view their side as their team, right? It's very weird to go to Facebook and see Trump or someone say something horrible, and then to see the analysis, instead of it being, wow, Trump said something horrible, to be, wow, the Democrats really didn't react to that the right way. And the metaphor I came up with for this, Brian, was, imagine you were reading an article about a basketball game, and it said, Greg Popovich lit the court on fire. Unfortunately, coach, sorry, my phone just busted. Got me distracted. But, unfortunately, Coach Kerr did not respond in time. As a result, the Spurs beat the Warriors. Let's pretend you read that. And if you go to Facebook, a bunch of people were saying, well, the thing of the matter is, Kerr really should have called his challenge. Kerr not calling his challenge is just, why Popovich is one of the best. And no one really looking at, did I just read that Coach Popovich lit the court on fire? Are we reading the same thing? And we were talking kind of a lot of Nate Silver's tweets, because I think that's what he does, right? And he'll make these takes that are very much trying to frame it in us versus them, etc., as opposed to trying to go, hey, what else is going on here? And I don't really have much more beyond that. And sorry, I did not disconnect this computer. As I mentioned, I changed computers a few weeks ago. I did not disconnect this one from my text thing, so apologies for being distracted in that, because my phone was texting me at the point. But, just this very funny treating politics as sports and also wanting to be business as usual, and then seeing people, Nate Silver, in my opinion, being the most famous, going, I want this to be normal. I want to approach this as a basketball game and analyze how the players are playing, as opposed to going a more holistic view and go, what the hell is going on?
Man, keep going.
That's all I got. And I actually want to try and disconnect my phone really quick from my computer. So if you have anything to say, this would be a good time.
No, I got distracted. I didn't follow everything you said there, so I trust our viewers to digest it.
So this was very much Brian and I, relating this to sports. Like, if you ever watch a baseball game and like the ball goes up and there are three people right there, and then they all drop it because they're all waiting on the other. That just happened here.
You were the guy calling for it, though. You were just talking, but it's okay.
All right, and it's very frustrating, Brian. I thought I quit on my computer. All right, so let's try. I got my politics out of the way, as you mentioned. Maybe in future, I'll tentatively say for next week, let's put it to the end of the show. So we'll make the promise last week that politics get the headliner spot. But let's talk something interesting. Two players, Draymond Green and CJ McCollum, both signed $100 million deals this last week. Draymond Green for 4 years, CJ McCollum for 3 years. Interestingly, I'm going to say Draymond Green contract seems absolutely fine. This is probably for the best for the Warriors. I think it's somewhat frustrating in that obviously the big name was Kevin Durant, and losing Kevin Durant hurts. But this is fine, and I think the Warriors, provided they don't do anything stupid, do have the point. With just Draymond Green and Steph Curry, have all the pieces they need to be a playoff team. The frustrating part being that they did give Klay Thompson that huge contract.
Oh, so much to say here. So first of all, I do have Green's contract up on Spotrac, and he's extended through 2023. He's going to be making $22 million next year, up to $27 million in 2023. That is way less than the max, and that does seem very team friendly. One thing I'll say is he didn't have a great year last year. He was hurt. And he has had some really good years. He was really good in the playoffs. So I would say, just based on the numbers alone, I don't think I would consider him to be like a slam dunk max player, right? But I thought his reputation in the league would be such that he would get a max deal. And okay, so one thing we should say is this is the most money the Warriors could offer him right now. But if he had waited till next offseason, he would have had another year of service. He could have gotten a bigger deal, right? So maybe, Draymond could have gotten more money, but I think him and his agent are being a little risk adverse here. I've seen people saying, like Bobby Marks, I think was one, saying, look, there's not a lot of cap space next offseason, so it makes sense for him to be a little risk adverse. Combine that with the injuries, this one is one of those deals that is team friendly, but might make sense for Draymond Green. In terms of the Warriors, go ahead.
I was going to say, in terms of the team friendly, you and I talked this a little, I think a couple weeks ago, but the funny part about Draymond Green being, there was the season where the Warriors won 73 games. And what's important to view whenever there's like an MVP caliber season or an all-time record smashing season is it's usually an outlier. Draymond Green was freaking amazing in 2016 when that happened, and the next season was good. But according to the Brian Star magnitude test, Draymond Green has only been at that level 1, maybe 2 years. As we've mentioned, depending on if you want to count power forwards with centers or without, power forwards get a little better. But I would really say 2016 and 2017 have really been the only 2 seasons in Draymond Green's career where we would call him a Brian Star. That's twice as good as an average player. And in fact, he's only been a Dre Star 1 season, 2016. So he had a really good outliery season in 2016 where he was amazing. He is a very good player at a very tough position. He is very versatile. We might argue, this is what's interesting, when we were talking with Greg Steele about how he analyzes player position and us, we might both argue that Draymond Green, with slightly less responsibility, right, playing a small forward instead of a power forward, might be a more valuable player. Mm-hmm. But from how the Warriors use Draymond Green, we would basically say he's a good, not great player, except for 2016, which we think is an outlier-ish season. That logic, by the way, is the same reason I'm like a little worried about the Bucks with them letting Malcolm Brogdon and Tony Snell go, is saying last season, Giannis Antetokounmpo was hands down easily the MVP player by every conceivable metric you could come up with for last season. But he played so freaking amazing that even if next season he is just 80% as good, he'll still be, Giannis could be 60% as good as he would last season, and I'd still say he's worth the max contract every year if he did that for the remainder of his prime. But that's how good he was last season. And so the same thing, like Draymond Green had this outliery season, has been good, not great. And as you're noting now, he's starting to get a little older. So I think this is a fair contract, a good contract for the Warriors. And I think his agent and him, I think you're right. Like, I think he probably realized his market value wasn't as high as that.
Well, if you want to look at the more if that's the glass half empty, the glass half full would be, well, his first 3 seasons, he was really good for a young player and improved a lot. That's the path you want to see. And then his 4th and 5th seasons, right? Those are the really good ones. And you're like, this is a good progression. He's a star now. He's just going to be really good. This team is winning titles. Then these last 2 seasons, setback, still above average, but not a star. Had a lot of injuries, right? So maybe if he's healthy, he could get back to, where he was when he was a star. He's not in his 30s yet or anything. So there's questions there. Maybe he could, have the ball more with Kevin Durant gone and he'll look a little better. So there's some upside for the Warriors, but I will say that it's almost at the point where Draymond Green is a little bit overrated now. I kind of see him as like Embiid, right? A player who I think is really, really good and a player I love, but I think mainstream now says is like a top 10 player, and I don't quite agree with that. So
I'd agree with that, because what I'd say, here's what's amusing to me, is there is an underratedness of great defensive players in NBA history, or more accurately, of players that are great at things not scoring. So my favorite player of all time, Dikembe Mutombo, I'm so glad he got in first ballot Hall of Fame. Now, annoyingly, people will, it's funny where we're like, I don't know if we brought up how Hamilton, actually this was pre-show, so you guys didn't get privy to this. We were talking pre-show about Alexander Hamilton and then General Smedley Butler. So these are huge names. We're going to leave the politics on the table. So that's your homework. If we're getting really bored during a podcast in the future, we might start talking Smedley Butler. But these are 2 huge names in U.S. history that were largely forgotten. Alexander Hamilton obviously kind of came back with a boom thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda's hit musical. But that's the point. For a large majority, people just didn't think about him. And it was basically that. It was if it wasn't for this hit musical, people probably would have underrated him in the course of history.
He's on the currency, though. I don't know if I buy this argument.
And then also don't forget there was that really famous Got Milk commercial about Aaron Burr killing Alexander Hamilton. So,
Yes, the great Michael Summers from San Francisco was the actor in that commercial.
But I guess what I would say is it was things outside of actual achievement that got them notoriety. And I would say Dikembe Mutombo, the finger wag and kind of the off-the-court stuff is what kept him in voters' minds as opposed to looking at his on-the-court contribution. So there is this tendency in the NBA to underrate non-primary scorer talents in the NBA. I've seen the flip side, and you mentioned Embiid. I would say Kobe Bryant and Draymond Green. There is the flip side where people get a stamp of approval of being a defensive player, and suddenly everybody overrates them relative to how good they actually are. And then it's funny because, like I said, then you hit the Ben Wallace, Dikembe Mutombo, and everybody accepts it. And then suddenly they're underrated because with how much you should rate them for that, they should be at the next strata, but they're not. But yeah, so I think Draymond Green is definitely in that boat where I think I agree with you, where I think he's a little overrated. But the good news is the contract he's signed to is one such that I have no complaints with it. That's the good news, right? You said if he's healthy, maybe he outperforms it. The problem with, say, comparing him to, say, Kevin Durant, where Kevin Durant is 100%. If Kevin Durant's healthy, he's worth this contract. If he's not healthy, we have no freaking idea.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good deal for the Warriors. I mean, if you compare it to the other contracts they've signed this offseason, it's pretty damn good. I mean, he's way better, I'd say, than Klay Thompson or D'Angelo Russell. So, no, I mean, the Warriors can be really good next season. Here's what's funny about it. I mean, so you know how I like to think about the NBA, right? Very Bayesian. I'm going to think, here's all the different scenarios heading into the Warriors offseason. What would I think would be the good ones? What would I think would be the bad ones? And the best one is probably they re-sign Kevin Durant, keep the whole team together, just go for another title. Well, we know that wasn't going to happen, right? Durant was now we know he was leaving, he decided a year ago. So that was never going to happen. So, my second best scenario is them keeping Iguodala and signing other stars and going for a title. My third best scenario is probably keeping some open money and not signing any bag deals, but keeping Curry around. And then the absolute worst scenario is signing a bunch of bad deals, right? Bad max contracts are the absolute worst thing you can have in the NBA. They signed 2 of them. So let me say this. Last season, what was the main problem with the Warriors? Well, I said it on a recent show. It was just the injuries, right? I loved their team on paper, but they all got hurt. But those injuries aside, what was their actual body of work last year for the regular season? Which, just to, let everyone know that maybe is not familiar, we think the regular season is much more important for evaluating a team than the playoffs. It's a much bigger sample size, and it's just, predicts more how well they're going to play in future games a lot better, right? So what was the Warriors' body work in the regular season? They were the best offensive team in the league, basically, by most stats, right? Rockets were up there on some, but they had the best field goal percentage the Warriors did, and really, really good on offense. That's what you expect, right? Really good at three-point shooting. They were a little worse than defense than usual, though. On their past championship teams, they were generally top 10 in defense, sometimes top 5, and played really well. And they were better, in the playoffs this last season, but people are saying, oh, maybe they weren't playing as hard in the regular season, but they were still good on defense. Regardless, they weren't that good. They were middle of the pack, right? So what do they go out and do this offseason? They just get rid of all their big players, and they just go as small as possible. They're chasing that long tail of offense, even though they were already first in offense, and they're just tanking defense, even though they were already middle of the pack. Spending money on defensive players would have been much better this offseason for them. That's why I'm so against this offseason. That being said, when you have Green, when you have Curry, when you have Kevon Looney as their third best player now, that's a really, really good core, and that's a good enough core to do some damage in the playoffs, despite the debacle of this offseason.
So you're giving me a perfect lead into a subject I wanted to discuss, which is how to evaluate player worth. So friend of the show, Greg Steele over at Greek God of Stats, did a write-up on how to analyze how much players are worth. And he used a technique that we in the past have used and that I have slowly come around to saying I disagree with. And this technique being, you look at a player's wins, right? You try and come up with some evaluation of how much they're worth. We use wins produced. Greg uses a variant of his, and these are very similar for what it's worth. Both of these use box score statistics as they compare to point margin, and then based on player position, grade them against average. And so you can think of this in very, baseball has done this forever, which is wins above replacement. This idea of you go through every position, catcher, first baseman, second baseman, compare to some fictional replacement players, what they do in baseball. In basketball, we compare to average. Both us and Greg do this. Now, we might have some disagreements in future, which we have tons of time to talk about, because the way Greg analyzes player position is essentially responsibility on offense and defense. And we might have some questions about that. I know you've brought this up, Brian, where you're saying there's no need to necessarily be the primary offensive handler on a team. If there was a way to, we've called it like pitch by committee in baseball, which is it's never really caught on as a popular theory, but in baseball, normally you have one pitcher that is supposed to pitch for 6 to 7 innings, ideally. And then you have a couple of relievers who come in for 1 or 2 innings each. And there's been this idea of, what if you had a bunch of pitchers that only pitch like 3 innings apiece? And the appeal of this is that then they can throw harder, right? They can throw more of their hot stuff and, might be harder to hit. And some of the reason this, I think, is not as appealing is pitchers know what gets them paid. And say, hey, if I'm not racking up wins, which is you need 5 contiguous innings to rack up a win in baseball. They're like, if I'm not going to rack up the win or the quality start or these other stats that matter, I'm not going to want to do it. So it's never really caught on. And in basketball, it's a similar idea. We've said, if a player like, the defensive Kobe Bryant, Donovan Mitchell players like that they need to take the shot. Somebody needs to take the shot. And you go, well, could you split up those shots between 4 or 5 people on the team? We argue there's no reason not to. So that's some of our potential disagreement with how Greg evaluates player position, where we might say that you are correct to call Donovan Mitchell a primary offensive weapon, and you are correct in how he compares to people in that position, but we think that position might not be needed in the NBA.
Yes.
How we might say it. And we might revisit that. But Greg does something that like Dave Barry has done before, which is you take a player's total wins compared to the salary cap, and you try and give them some value, right? There are 1,230 wins available in an NBA season. You can put some amount of money on those, depending on how you want to break it up. I've said before, you might want to look at a 50-win team at salary cap. That's kind of what I would consider a good litmus test, whereas you might just do the average, right? 12 total salary in the NBA divided by 1,230. That's how much you think a win is worth. Current NBA, based on the salary cap, a win, if you were doing that methodology, would probably be somewhere about $2.5 million a win, which is why, for instance, we don't think that Draymond Green, if you're using a methodology like that, is that bad, because at 25 mil a season, if I'm saying $2.5 million a win, right, that's like 7 or 8 wins, which he easily hits, especially, and I brought this up before, if you do say there is some value to being a good playoff player. But, as I just mentioned, after all of that preamble explaining a technique, I've started thinking against this methodology of just doing a linear wins to money ratio, because when you were talking about the Warriors construction, that is a key part about an NBA team. One of my favorite anecdotes, stories, metaphor lessons is by a guy named Dan Gilbert, not the owner of the Cavaliers. He is, I believe, a Harvard, I think, psychology or economics professor, because he does behavioral psychology economics. I believe behavioral economics, sorry. And he wrote the book Stumbling on Happiness. So Dan Gilbert brings up this point. Would you pay $20 for a Big Mac? And then, of course, this is a gotcha, right? Anybody who's used to brain teasers, riddles is going to go, I know that I want to say no, but you're going to find some way to make me say yes, which is, he goes, what if you had nothing to eat and you just got on a flight to Australia and they tell you, hey, sorry, flight, the meal plan for this flight is canceled. Sorry, we weren't able to get food on the plane. So there is no available food on this plane to Australia, and it's, a 12 to 16-hour flight. And someone in front of you has a Big Mac, and all you have in your wallet is a $20 bill. Would you consider offering that person $20 for their Big Mac because you're that hungry? And that's probably what it would take to get them to say, hey, yeah, sure, I'll give up my food. So that's the gotcha. It's the buying for need. And this comes up all the time in sports, right? When you did something awesome there, which is you're saying, what are the assets that I like on the Warriors that we have? Which I think you rightfully noted, right, would be Curry, Draymond Green, Kevon Looney. Do you count Willie Cauley-Stein? Would you put him up there?
I don't. So he's a good young player, but I don't think I wouldn't depend on him as much as those three, I guess. Okay. Looney, if you look at Looney's numbers last year, he was amazing. Like he's coming off like a broken collarbone. Maybe that'll hurt him, but he's already starting to practice, I think. So yeah, I put him above Cauley-Stein quite a bit.
So anyway, but you're basically kind of doing a survivor on a desert island thing. You're like, let's look at what assets we have and let's look at what we need. That's how you approach it. And so that's how I've kind of started looking at basketball, because I've noted, for instance, Paul Millsap's a player that the Nuggets at the time absolutely overpaid for. And I still think he is overpaid. But in this offseason, they offered him a 1-year extension on his deal because it was a player option. And I said, look, if there was nothing better on the market, and the Nuggets, right, they were, 53-win team last season, I think. Am I getting that right?
They're the number 2 seed at any rate, and we should expect them to be a title contender this season for sure.
54.
Yeah.
So they 54 games last season. They have a young core of talented players. This is like Nikola Jokic, Will Barton, Gary Harris, Jamal Murray.
Can I interrupt briefly, Dre? I've listened to Seth Partnow's first podcast. He was on with Sam Vecini from The Athletic. And one of the questions was, who are the most underrated players now that you can talk again after 3 years? He said it was Jokic.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Although, I mean, Jokic finished 4th in MVP voting above any.
Yeah, can you call that underrated?
He's on everybody's list. We were just talking about players like, Draymond Green or whatever, this weird roller coaster of underrated, overrated, underrated, overrated. And I think Jokic is somewhere on this curve where he's probably close to being properly rated, and he's going to tip one way or the other, right?
He's a great example. They were actually pondering Jokic versus Embiid on that podcast, and they thought, yeah, Embiid's probably better. And I think the two of us would say, no way. I think Jokic, and it's not even close. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think if I don't know why. By the way, on that you said you listened to that podcast. Did Partnow say anything about?
I might be pronouncing Vecini wrong, by the way. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Apologies, Sam.
But did he say anything about why he is no longer with the Bucks? I'm very curious.
Yeah. Damn, I didn't want to derail your whole thing.
This is.
Okay, yeah, I'll try to summarize this podcast. So this will be like a subtweet or whatever, trying to summarize a podcast on another podcast. But so he gave a political answer, which was basically, one, he wanted to spend more time with his young kids. That's very fair. But the other was something like he wanted to spend more time working on stuff that was interesting to him. So anyone who does that kind of work, that's true, right? That could be a real thing, but that could be a political answer saying, I didn't like the direction the Bucks were going in with their work. I wanted to go in a different direction. So who knows?
What I'll say is, if you look at NBA front offices, you can look at Daryl Morey as what everybody's aspiring to. One of my favorite Freakonomics podcast, I think it was in one of their books, but they talked about drug dealers versus the McDonald's Corporation. And the reason they okay. is if you compared the hierarchy chart of McDonald's to a drug dealer, to a drug cartel, or just whatever, they looked almost identical, right? If you removed the titles from both and put them next to each other, they look the same. And it very much kind of turns into a pyramid scheme, to be honest, or mid-level marketing scheme, right? Which you have a bunch of underpaid people at the small levels, and then you eventually, if you can make it into basically middle management or higher, you make good money. And I think
the franchises are a big deal.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, if you've got a McDonald's franchise, if you're a worker or even a manager there, you're not making good money. But if you can own a franchise, you can actually make good money. And so the reason I bring this up in comparison to sports is it's not even a secret. It's a well-known fact that if you go to work for an NBA team, they don't pay well. In fact, I got to give a big shout out. I think it's
you're saying in the front office, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of his. I always get his name wrong, so I'm gonna get it up in front of me. But he was talking about how the Houston Astros, I believe, they keep having these great analytics people, but they don't pay them, so they keep losing these analytics. Yes. And he's like, why don't you give them? Why don't you treat them right? Why don't you actually? Sorry.
So the Astros are on top of the world right now. They're the best team again this year, or close to it. I would guess they're doing the same thing the Warriors are doing, which is drinking their own Kool-Aid. They're like, we're the Astros, we're so good, we don't need all these clowns in the analytics department. That would, as a baseball follower, that would be my guess.
And apologies, by the way, at forgetting your name, because he's one of my favorite follows on Twitter. Christopher D. Long, Octonion. You should definitely follow him if you don't.
Oh yeah, he's a math guy, right, Dre?
He's a huge math. Yeah, he one of the things he just tweets out like really hard math puzzles that I don't know the answers to all the time. But he was saying it. He's like, why don't you treat your freaking analytics squad right? He's like, if a team goes to the World Series, the star players, they'll give them a car or whatever. It's like, why aren't you treating your analytics squad right? It is a well-known fact that if you want to be an analytics person in sports, until you get to basically assistant general manager or higher, you're underpaid for your work.
Or you can go the Dean Oliver route and become a coach. That's the other way.
So let's point this out about Dean Oliver. Dean Oliver wrote the Basketball on Paper in the mid-2000s. Everybody knows Dean Oliver. He got a job working with the Seattle Supersonics, then went and got a job for the Denver Nuggets, then got unceremoniously ousted with the Denver Nuggets when Masai Ujiri came in. Went and got a job for ESPN, left ESPN, got a job with the Kings, then got unceremoniously ousted with the Kings and is now with the Wizards. So on the one hand, you go, oh, Dean Oliver is what I want to be. Whereas I look at that and I go,
yeah.
If you're one of the most respected people in stats and have had multiple teams and front off and ESPN right not treat you right, I don't know how I feel about that. And
he's a big success story, and it's not much of a success yet.
That's the thing. People are like, Dean Oliver got a job with the Wizards. How do you feel about that? And I'm like, talk to me in 2 years. So you mentioned Seth Partnow gave the very political answer. Well, he's given 3 years of his life to the Bucks, and it's just very possible that he went, oh, I'm not going to make it to drug cartel top level. That's not going to happen. And that might be the decision, as you mentioned. And it does make absolute sense to say, I want to spend more time with my kids and doing stuff interesting than this, because it doesn't pay well. If you're at a job that pays well, it's very easy to go, F it. If you want me to do data entry, I'll do data entry. I don't care. You're paying me.
He didn't mention the pay, but he did mention the hours. He mentioned that if you work for a team, you're expected to work, way, way, way more than 40 hours a week, right?
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite anecdotes I brought up multiple times in the show now. But I said, when I got my first job, which was an entry-level job at a small GIS firm. So GIS is Geographic Information Systems. It's basically adding spatial data. These are maps with database data, things like consumer data. And in my case, it's facilities, gas, power, electric. So, you want these maps of gas, power, and electric data. Which customers do we have? Who does an outage affect, et cetera, that kind of stuff. Very fascinating, by the way, does relate very well. Spatial data plus data equates very well to the NBA. So I got that. I saw a job posting for the Rockets, and I really, really wish I had a screen cap this, where they were asking for a senior database administrator. And as I mentioned, there were kind of not dog whistle, but the code words that mean exactly what you're saying. I want you to work all hours. When you see words like go getter, high availability, they're saying we expect you to work a 60 to 80 hour week. And then when I got to the end of it, they were offering less than my starting salary. And as I mentioned, I was at a small firm in a small market when I got my first job, and our senior database analyst was our senior database administrator was poached by a client that we still worked with, which meant they were willing to offer him a huge pay deal and deal with the political ramifications of a consultant that they had contracts with. They were willing to deal with that because he was that valuable. And I went, that's the real world. This is a small market niche field that means a senior database administrator is worth over six figures easily. And an NBA team was offering like $40,000 a year with the expectation that you were working 60 to 80 hours a week. So it's a well-known fact about working for a team, which is kind of ridiculous, right? Because my company, I know for a fact, at least my section of the company, because we were part of a bigger company that was part of a bigger company. So the huge company was probably worth billions, but our little portion of the company, if they ever sold us off, was not worth $1 billion, nowhere close. Every NBA team is worth $1 billion. So it almost gets laughable when you go, in the real world, my salary is six figures plus. If I was, if Seth Partnow, not Milwaukee, but if Seth Partnow went to, Dallas or Houston or any place in Los Angeles, would be worth a lot of money. He's worth less than that on a team and goes, if I'm not going to approach the general managership, it is not worth my time.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. It's possible the Athletic might have poached him from the Bucks. Maybe they would have. I bet he's making more money with the Athletic than he is at the Bucks.
Yeah, that's the funny part, right? Is in the real world, a conglomeration of writers that is working with venture capital is not going to poach a senior data analyst, software developer, et cetera, from a big firm, right? If The Athletic was poaching people from Microsoft or Google or Facebook, I would be shocked. But they can probably poach people from NBA teams because NBA teams don't really pay for analytics, and candidly, it shows.
Well, look at it the opposite way. There was a big to-do 5 years ago or so when it was found out that there was an anti-poaching compact between Google, Apple, and some of the other major companies, right? And huge scandal. And then compare that to the NBA and other sports. It's just codified that you can't do that, right? It's ridiculous. It's so funny.
Well, yeah, it gets interesting. I don't know how it works between teams. I imagine it would be a much bigger deal, right? That's another problem with an NBA team, right? Is if you're working for the Rockets and you want to go work for the Bucks or the Celtics. Let's say you're working for the Celtics. Not Celtics, sorry. Let's get this other way out. You're working for the Bucks. Buckets are a small market team with not as much money, and the Celtics want you. That is a much different scenario than if you are working for a small company and Google wants you. Because obviously, if you leave the Bucks to go to the Celtics, that causes rifts. And the Celtics might say, look, it's not worth us potentially losing a trade partner for a multi-million-dollar asset in the future to get a data analyst that's a little better.
And then think about the players. Like, they literally can only work for one team.
Well, it does make me laugh that they still said that Embiid is better than Jokic, which is hilarious. But, you know, that's good. And I'll be interested to hear what else he says. And I'm glad he actually did talk a little behind the curtain. That'll be fun to see if he does more of that.
Yeah, I might have to re-listen to that. But, you know, it was a conversation at least. So, you know, we were slightly different than them, but not way different.
I have no idea where I was in the middle of my long drawn out point about building a team, but it's saying you want to take stock of what you have, you want to take stock of what you need, and then you can make the Big Mac decision, right? Okay, we are a 45-win team. There is a window for us to win a title. This player that is this Al Horford is a perfect example of this, by the way. I've said this before. I thought Al Horford was overpaid, but given the success he helped the Celtics to, was probably worth it. If you can't do better than Al Horford, that is the real question, right? Because there are probably players like Hassan Whiteside or others who we might think are better players than Al Horford that you could probably acquire, but we'll leave that on the table. Let's say you can't acquire them. If you can't acquire a better player than Al Horford, and Al Horford jumps you from a 45-win team to a 50-plus win team, and a 50-plus win team, as we saw with the Celtics, they were the weakest team in NBA history to make a conference finals and should have honestly made the finals if not for LeBron James being LeBron James. They were almost the weakest team in NBA history to make an NBA finals since the Houston Rockets in the late 80s, mid-80s. That's worth it, right? So on the one hand, I see the cold calculating economist take of how to evaluate building a team, but my thinking on that has changed a lot. And we in fact talked to Greg Steele about this, where let's say you overpay for a player. Let's say you overpay for a Chris Paul. You're allowed to trade players in the NBA, and there are often undervalued assets as well as overvalue in things like draft picks. So any contract in the NBA is tradable. So even if I overpay for the full contract, there's nothing that says I don't still get value out of that contract because I'm able to trade it. That is our hope, by the way, with the Warriors and D'Angelo Russell. He is not worth that money. But if they trade him for something, he might be worth that money.
Yeah, so you're right. And the way it went, there was news stories basically when he first signed that, oh, he's definitely getting traded. He doesn't fit that team at all. And then after that sat for a while, the team started to push back because you have to, right? Even if they do plan on trading him, he's going to be there for at least a few months. So they have to say, oh, in fact, there's a news story about that today. Steve Kerr says Klay Thompson, D'Angelo Russell, and Steph Curry can all play together, and that's their long-term plan, right? Who knows? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe that's just team speak. But the point is they never had to get into this situation to begin with. It looks like they had no plan at all relating to Kevin Durant leaving. They got blindsided by it, which is crazy considering what we know now. And they panicked and did the sign-and trade. If they were planning, they would have kissed off Kevin Durant and used that money for something else. And you can say, oh, what about Klay's cap hold? Well, they should have signed and traded Klay also. Klay and D'Angelo Russell, those two contracts probably will end the Warriors dynasty. And I say probably because it might not happen, but probably.
Kevin Durant into D'Angelo Russell might make a little bit of sense in that there are weird things about being over or under the salary cap. In an NBA, if you trade for a player worth $20 million and you're over the salary cap, you have to send that amount out. So in that way, I always hate this. I always hate grading a move on future moves. D'Angelo Russell might not be bad. We'll see.
He's only 23.
Well, I'm not saying like that. I have no.
I'm saying okay, he's a black box. Like, he's just too young to know.
I'm okay dying on this hill saying I do not believe that D'Angelo Russell will ever be worth the max in the NBA. I'm okay saying that.
That's yeah. I'm
gonna stake it right now, just very much like I called Russell Westbrook overrated when he was a young player. That's what I do, Brian. I'm okay saying that, but I'm saying them picking up D'Angelo Russell for Kevin Durant because it means they now have the ability to turn D'Angelo Russell into a $20+ million a year player should such a player become available. If Giannis Antetokounmpo wants off in a year of the Bucks, the Warriors have a player that might be able to do that. That's fine. The Klay Thompson one, unfortunately, is just right out.
Yeah.
That one, the problem with them signing him to that amount of money is that, one, he is untradeable right now, right? With his health, he is untradeable, and they don't know what he'll become. That's the difference. If Kevin Durant is gone no matter what, and you can get a salary cap holder back in return, that's fine. Klay Thompson, though, you don't know what he's going to be, and you don't know if he is ever movable, and that's why he was a huge mistake.
Yeah, that's true. And you're right. They could redeem it and could, turn it into something later. But they've overly complicated things. They made it more difficult for that cap room to turn into something good. And two, they're tanking a full season of Steph Curry's prime.
Yes.
They should have kept Andre Iguodala. They should have used the money to get some center like Derek Favors. And they could have won a title next year. It would have been so easy. I think they could have easily made a team as good as last year's team without Kevin Durant using their money. They could have done it so easily, but they chose not to. They chose to keep the injured Klay, and they chose to get this 23-year-old guy that maybe can become good or maybe can turn into something and may not. So that's why I think even though there's some upside to it, the situation they're in right now anyway, it still was a badly executed plan as well. And I realize I'm sounding like an asshole because let's kick Klay while he's down. I mean, Klay will be fine. They could have signed and traded Klay to the Lakers, and he could have made all his money anyway. So Klay's going to be fine no matter what in this scenario.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's where I'm falling. As I'm saying, I don't know if Klay was signed and tradable. If you think he was, then yes, what they did is absolutely. I would
think he would be, yeah.
You have me so angry with Derek Favors, though, because Derek Favors is such a perfect fit with this team as construct. You could do Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, Kevon Looney, Derek Favors. That is an amazing.
No, Andre Iguodala is still on the team under my scenario.
In your scenario,
yes.
Andre Iguodala is getting a little older. I
don't
still
care.
Klay Thompson for Otto Porter or something would have been.
Do you want a hot take, Dre? Here's my hot take. I think Andre Iguodala over the next 2 seasons will be better than D'Angelo Russell easily. Money aside, just straight production.
I think that's going to be a fascinating title.
I don't think it's a sure bet. I say it's like 50-50, but I think it's a pretty decent chance.
I think you've titled the show, though. Anyway, we'll see about that. All right. So, by the way, I'm going to end this on something utterly trivial as well, Brian. So, it's funny. We went from
we got CJ McCollum as well.
Oh, yeah. CJ McCollum. Oh, yeah. So, sorry. I completely forgot that because Draymond Green was such a perfect tangent into all that stuff there that I wanted to talk about. CJ McCollum is just right out. So I have absolutely no idea what the hell Portland is thinking. CJ McCollum still has another year left on his deal. They signed him to a veterans extension. So not this next year he was on his old contract. For 3 seasons after next year, they're signing him to $33 million a year. CJ McCollum is a player that we've only thought is above average once in his career. He is very good at three-point shooting, not really good at much else. I do not understand what the hell they're thinking here.
So what they're thinking is that three-point shooting is really valuable and you have to overpay to get it. But that, or we just think he's a star. Obviously, he's not a star, right? You just said it. He's a three-point specialist who doesn't know his role and plays like a star and takes too many shots. So he's not that. But so that's probably their thinking, right? They just overvalue him. They overvalue consistency and they overvalue chemistry and their own, again, drinking their own Kool-Aid. Here's the other thing I'll say about CJ McCollum. We say this all the time. he is a very, very well-liked player. You know, he has his own podcast, and, you know, it's really good, probably a lot better than this one. I've listened to it a few times. So that, yeah, I mean, he's just one of those guys who's always going to be around because he's so well-liked.
Is that what
shoot the three?
When I went off on politics, you just were like, okay, I got a few minutes here. Dre's rambling, and you hopped on CJ McCollum. So I won't feel offended.
He's probably talking politics too, but I don't know.
Well, that just as a last capper on that, we've talked this before, where the NBA gets fascinating in that a lot of times how well a player or person is liked can impact their career. Brian Scalabrine is infamous for this. He himself talked about it. He's like, if you want to be the 10th to 12th man on the bench, if you're well liked, that goes a lot further than being productive on the court, because you're the 10th to 12th guy. If you're productive, other teams are going to want you. So if that's the role you want, being well liked trumps so many other things.
And I'll just say briefly, just about the role player versus superstar thing. And I wrote an article about this a long time ago, one of the few articles I've written on boxscoregeeks.com. But so that the difference between I consider Klay Thompson and CJ McCollum to be very similar players production-wise. Of course, physically they're way different. People would probably consider Klay to be a better defender. But their production is very similar, right? Really, really good three-point shooters, about 40% career each, I think. Not bad two-point shooters, don't give you a whole lot else at all, right? That kind of guy is a role player on your team. Look at a player like Steph Curry. He's, first of all, much better three-point shooter than those two even. But he just does so much more. He's one of the best finishers at the rim in the league. He's, one of the best passers. He gets a ton of rebounds for a guard. He gets steals, which those two guys aren't. He's a real superstar because he does everything, not just the three-point shooting. That's the difference.
And that's what makes basketball rough. Is basketball, in other sports, football is the most notorious. You can go for specialists. Basketball is the sport where you do need a player to either absolutely dominate a category. And sorry, CJ McCollum does not absolutely dominate scoring. Klay Thompson comes the closest, but then the issue is actually fit, right? Klay Thompson can get around 60% true shooting, amazing shooter, but he's been on a team with Steph Curry his entire career.
Well, let me put it a slightly different way. I'd say CJ McCollum and Klay Thompson fit perfectly next to Damian Lillard and Steph Curry, right? Guys that are good three-point shooters that should just stand there and shoot them, right? So that's great. The problem is the money. They should both be paid a lot less money for that role. That's all.
Yes, I'd agree with that point. All right. So as I mentioned, I have an utterly silly thing to end the podcast on, Brian. I have been appropriately ratioed on Twitter. Ratio, for those that don't know, is if you do a tweet and you get way more comments than likes or retweets, it means that everybody says, oh my goodness, what are you thinking about? I'll explain the backstory. My wife and my wife got us a Twix for dessert tonight, and I didn't want my son to know, so I spelled it out. I said, is the COOKIE, where is it? I said that to my wife, so my son wouldn't know I was talking about it. And my wife was like, what are you talking about? It's not a cookie. And so I went to Twitter and I said, could you call a Twix a cookie? And I have been appropriately ratioed. The internet is like, what the hell are you talking about? No. So I'll just leave that as out into the ether, into the audience as well. Is a Twix a cookie? I briefly thought yes, although I'm going to go by the democratization of the internet and say I take the L here. I was wrong.
Yeah, it makes me wonder what the definition of a cookie is now. I'm curious.
Although, by the way, a hot dog is absolutely a sandwich.
Yeah.
That one I'm never backing down. All right, Brian, anything you want to end on before I send us out? I don't have any shout outs or anything this week.
Yeah, I guess after bad-mouthing CJ McCollum and Klay Thompson's play, I will give them a shout out for their good business acumen and getting paid. Good job getting paid, those two guys. Yeah, that's great. I guess I'll give a brief esports shout out. I've been doing less of those, but man, if you have any interest in esports at all, Evolution, the Evo Championship just happened this weekend. The best event of the year happened in Las Vegas, the Fighting Game Championship. And so, yeah, go check out all the winners and all the news from that. It was pretty hype.
Awesome.
Those are my shout-outs.
Twitch, where we just talk silly stuff. All right. That's been our show. If you find us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. We go live every week, twitch.tv/nerd numbers. Usually we've been keeping this up, Brian, around 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. on twitch.tv/Nerd Numbers. You can find recaps on the show on channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube. We have an iTunes and Stitcher show, the Boxscore Geek Show. Subscribe, upvote helps us out. I've been your host, Dre Alvarez. You can find me most places as Nerd Numbers. Co-host Brian Foster, you can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. That's been our show, and we'll see you next week.